buckle up because we are diving deep into the Black Dahlia case today. One of those mysteries that never seems to go away.
Seems like every few years it pops back up, right?
Yeah, it really does. You've sent over a ton of articles, Wikipedia entries, the whole deal.
Yeah.
So I guess it's time to try to separate fact from fiction, right? Figure out what makes this case so captivating, even after all these years.
Right.
I think to really unpack it, we got to start with Elizabeth Short herself, the victim.
For sure.
Because it's easy to get lost in all the headlines, the sensationalism, all that, and forget that there's a real woman with, a whole life before all this.
Absolutely. I mean, that's something that often gets lost in these big cases, right? Just the humanity of the victim. So getting any glimpse we can into her life before, even if it's just through these historical records, is important.
Yeah, and even from what we've got, it sounds like, she'd been through a lot even before coming to Hollywood.
Yeah.
Some of these articles mention a rough family life, some health issues. Seems like she'd faced her share of challenges.
Yeah, she really had some tough breaks early on. Her dad wasn't around for part of her childhood, had some respiratory problems, even her fiance dying in World War II. So yeah, I mean, things that undoubtedly shaped who she was, but don't by any means define her story.
Right, and then there's this whole thing about her being an aspiring actress.
Right.
Which, some of these sources really play that up.
Yeah.
So was that actually a huge part of her life? Or is that more like, part of the whole Black Dahlia mythos?
Yeah, that's one of those things that's hard to pin down for sure. I mean, she was young in Hollywood, a place known for, ambition and chasing fame.
Right.
So was she actively pursuing acting? Or was it more of a kind of a dream? It's tough to say definitively, but regardless, it kind of plays into the media frenzy that surrounded her murder,
Well, yeah, and that's what I find so interesting, right? Because it almost feels like regardless of what the truth of it was, that narrative, the whole aspiring actress thing, it was almost like the perfect story for the media to latch onto.
Oh, for sure.
To create this whole captivating backstory.
It fed into all those existing perceptions of Hollywood, right?
Yeah.
That it's this glamorous place, but also seedy, especially for young women.
Right.
And the media at the time definitely capitalized on all those things in their coverage.
Totally. Okay, so it's January 1947. Elizabeth Short disappears. And then 6 days later, her body's found in that vacant lot. And, well, this is not your average crime scene.
It was a scene meant to shock, even for people who had seen it all, I mean, the way her body was posed, the mutilations, it was horrific. This wasn't just about taking a life, it was about sending a message,
Yeah, they describe it as the Glasgow smile, which, I mean, for anyone who doesn't know, it's where the victim's mouth is cut into this awful grin.
Brutal.
It's beyond chilling. And it feels so personal, like the killer wanted her to be found and remembered in this really specific, awful way.
And the methodical nature of it, too. I mean, the killer took the time to completely drain her body of blood, which makes you think about the level of premeditation, maybe even some anatomical knowledge, It wasn't just a crime of passion, it was calculated.
And you know what always gets me? The lack of blood at the scene.
Oh, yeah.
It's like they prepped her body somewhere else entirely. That takes some serious planning and an understanding of how to control the crime scene,
Absolutely. I mean, that level of planning on top of everything else, the posing, the mutilations, it tells you the killer wanted to terrify not just whoever found her, but anyone who heard about it.
And you know what? It worked. This case still makes headlines. So we've got this young woman, her life cut tragically short, and a crime scene that seems like something out of a horror movie. What happens next? I mean, the LAPD had to have been under incredible pressure to solve this thing.
Oh, the pressure was on, for sure. I mean, this wasn't just another murder for them to solve. It was like this media frenzy, bigger than anything they'd seen before.
Yeah, and you can definitely tell from these articles, especially the LA Examiner, they really went hard on this case.
Oh, yeah.
Feels like some of them were more interested in, a good story than actually reporting the facts. Did that make it harder for the LAPD to actually investigate?
100%. I mean, you've got this media frenzy constantly churning out stories, half of them wrong. It's got to be impossible to sort through it all. You're trying to solve this really complex puzzle, but the pieces keep changing.
And then there's that whole thing with Elizabeth Short's mother, luring her out to L.A. with that promise they'd found her alive.
It's awful.
Just despicable.
It's like they just completely threw ethics out the window for a juicy headline. And the worst part is it still happens today, The lines get blurred.
Yeah, for sure. So you've got this huge investigation, media's going crazy, pressure's coming from everywhere. Did the LAPD ever narrow down the suspects?
Well, they chased down hundreds of leads, tons of dead ends, most of them because of all the media hype. But a few names do keep popping up, both from back then and from people looking at the case more recently. And two of the most interesting ones got to be Dr. George Hodel and Leslie Dillon.
Yeah, Dr. George Hodel. His name always seems to come up,
Mm-hmm.
especially with his son, Steve Hodel, doing all that investigating himself, right?
Right, Steve Hodel, he was a homicide detective himself, LAPD. And he was convinced his own father did it, even wrote a whole book about it.
Yeah.
And he pointed to some pretty creepy things. Like, there was this photo found in his dad's stuff, a woman that looks a lot like Elizabeth Short. And then the soil samples they took from the basement of George Hodel's house.
Yeah, what about those?
Years later, they tested them, and they found traces of human decomposition.
Oh, wow.
Which, I mean, that's a pretty big deal.
That definitely lends credence to his theory.
Right. And on top of that, you got the fact that George Hodel, he was a surgeon. So the way Elizabeth Short's body was treated.
Right, he would have the knowledge.
Exactly. And then there's that recording, the LAPD got it when they were tailing him back in 1950, and you can hear him say something like, "They can't talk to my secretary because she's dead."
Chilling.
Right. Especially with everything else we know.
So, with all that, how come they never charged him?
It's a good question. I mean, it's all circumstantial, right? It's definitely suspicious, all the coincidences and everything, but nothing concrete enough to really put him away.
Okay, so then what about this Leslie Dillon, the other name you mentioned? What makes him such a good suspect?
So this is where things get really interesting. There's this author, Pugh Eatwell. She wrote a book, Black Dahlia, Red Rose, and she lays out a really strong case for Dillon. See, he was a bellhop at the Biltmore Hotel, and Elizabeth Short was known to hang out there sometimes. But here's the thing. He used to work as a mortician's assistant.
Whoa.
Yeah, so he knew how to deal with bodies, embalming, the whole thing.
That's a whole other level.
Right. And it gets creepier. Eatwell found out that right after Short disappeared, a room in that hotel was completely scrubbed clean, a room Dillon had access to.
Oh, man.
And not only that, but he also knew the area where they found her purse, and he was connected to this guy, Mark Hansen, a nightclub owner who might have been involved too.
Wow. Okay, so we've got two really strong suspects here, both with some pretty convincing arguments. So which one is it?
That's the million-dollar question, right? It's tough because both theories really hinge on circumstantial evidence and people's interpretations of it. It's like the ultimate game of Clue, you know? No smoking gun, so you can argue it forever.
That's got to be frustrating. But I guess that's part of why this case is still so fascinating, right? Even after all this time, we still don't really know. But we've gone down the rabbit hole of suspects. So what is it about the Black Dahlia that keeps drawing people in? Even after all these years, it's like we were talking about before, with all these articles and theories, the Black Dahlia case has almost become this story we tell, you know?
Oh, absolutely.
Like it's bigger than just a crime at this point.
It's become this whole legend, right? Fueled by Hollywood, and, well, people love an unsolved mystery, don't they?
They do.
I mean, you've got Elizabeth Short. She's been in movies, books, even music.
Yeah.
And every time, it adds a new layer to it all.
And it makes you wonder, are we, like by keeping this story alive, are we doing the opposite of getting closer to the truth?
That's a good question. I mean, it's easy to get caught up in the mystery of it all, right? Trying to piece it together.
Right.
But we can't forget that a real person lost her life. A young woman with her whole future ahead of her. And yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So where do we even go from here after all these years? Is there any chance this case will ever be solved?
It's hard to say. Time can be a real problem with these old cases. Evidence disappears, people forget things, the trail goes cold. But I don't think that means giving up on finding answers is the answer either.
Because even if we never get that, that final piece of the puzzle, there's still something valuable about looking into cases like this, isn't there?
For sure. Every time we look back at a case, break down what we know, look at it from different angles, it teaches us something. Not just about the past, but about ourselves. About why we're drawn to the unknown and how we try to make sense of these terrible things.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So as we come up from this deep dive, what's the thing we should all remember about the Black Dahlia?
I think it's that we have to see past the headlines, past all the stories. Elizabeth Short's story, it reminds us that every unsolved mystery, every cold case, it all goes back to a real person. And even though her life was cut short, it deserves to be remembered.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. Sometimes the mysteries that stay with us the most The ones that make us think and question and keep searching, those are the ones that matter.